Welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, the podcast for all disciplines, paths, players, and game masters, with your questers of horrifical things, Josh and Dan. I'm Dan.
I'm Josh.
And on today's podcast, as stated, we will be discussing all things horrifical. I know it's a lousy word. As we talk about two of our introductory named horrors. So if you have any questions about anything you're about to hear or need to weep on our shoulder because you're scared about them, contact us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. So we're going to talk about Ristul and then Taint, because we think we can get both of these in on the same episode. There's just enough information about both of them. I like the fact that Ristul is written from the point of Cymric from the novel Prophecy, because he was the main character.
Right. He's the main character in the novel Prophecy. The novel Prophecy, the bad guys, the villains in that book are connected with Ristul. The Nethermancer, who's kind of the bad guy in Prophecy, gets name dropped in this entry in the Horrors sourcebook. I would not be surprised if this particular entry
is by Greg Gordon.
Was by Greg. Let me check the credits. Let's see. Writing. Greg Gordon does appear in the credits.
There you go.
So I suspect we'll talk about some of the others later. There's another horror where I'm pretty sure I knew who wrote the entry because of things.
Ristul is, I think, one of the more interesting named horrors because it's more esoteric in scope.
Yeah.
Because Ristul is not an individual being. There's no body. There's no mind. There's no consciousness or identity. It just
at least to the extent that we understand such things.
Yeah. I also love the fact that Ristul is just an abbreviation of this. I don't even know what language this is, but Ria is to leave Ayrton. Action eternally corrupting. So I'll repeat that. Rian is to leave Ayrton, which is how you get Ristul. But Ristul corrupts all and is all that Ristul corrupts. So it's kind of like the snake eating its own tail, Ouroboros. It just is eternally corrupting and therefore growing because it's corrupting and just, yeah.
We talk about at times how the horrors have this kind of Cthulhuoid Lovecraftian vibe about them. And I think out of all of the horrors, especially the named horrors, Ristul is the one who comes closest to really epitomizing the vast, unknowable aspect of that genre of cosmic horror when it comes to things. You could interpret this entry and the description of Ristul as all of the astral pollution, all of the tainted energy within astral space is in a way a manifestation or an expression of Ristul's presence as just this corrupting force. There's not necessarily any real directed intelligence behind it, at least not in any kind of way that we would understand such things, but everything that it comes in contact with becomes tainted and infected and corrupted and spreads that corruption to other places, even if unintentionally.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, those that fall under Ristul's sway will end up spreading that corruption. And there are many ways that manifests itself. There are different sort of ways that one might end up interacting with Ristul, but there really isn't an actual horror that you can go and beat up to defeat this.
It's kind of like, it's kind of like glitter.
Yeah.
It corrupts everything. You can't get rid of it. There's no actual source of it. It's just, it just is.
There's kind of this implacability to Ristul that you ultimately can't really defeat it. Like there is nothing to defeat. All you might be able to do is clean up a little bit temporarily.
One corner of
and
it.
Perhaps
Yeah.
the only way to ultimately get rid of Ristul is to get rid of magic, to get rid of its ability to survive,
broaden,
or whatever.
Yeah.
Within the world. That as long as there is some capacity for it to exist,
yeah,
that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Cymric talks about how those who get subsumed by it are destroyed, but there's the idea that perhaps the consciousness is not completely lost, and it is atomized and scattered and spread out amongst the vastness of the corruption that is Ristul, but is still somehow aware of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the torment that kind of exists as it is melanged together with all of the other minds that are part of this thing. Again, like, I'm getting the kind of Event Horizon kind of sense of this thing, that it's just like coming into contact with this is mind-shattering and vastly incomprehensible and unknowable, and that it is an ocean. It's an ocean of corruption, in a sense, and that there is no way ultimately to
contain that,
be extracted from that once you have been consumed.
Yeah. And there's also no way to contain it. It's just so vast. Like I said, until the magic disappears, which is where it lives, breathes, feeds on, expands, blah, 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 you're not going to be able to touch it. You know, go ahead and punch the wave. What is that going to do you? Not a lot. So what my favorite quotes out of this entire essay: what Ristul corrupts, Ristul absorbs.
My favorite is his bit at the beginning where he's like, imagine that we're sitting in a tavern and you're listening to what I'm saying and you like, you know, I'm like, why are you in such a hurry to die? Cymric is a great character.
Yeah.
I like how in this essay, it is very clearly like further along in his career, that he's a little bit more experienced and world-wise, as opposed to the kind of con man that he is in Prophecy.
Yeah.
And how, despite being a wizard, ultimately doesn't take himself completely seriously.
Greg wrote him well. He gives it a wonderful sense of humor. It gets to expand in this little essay, more so than the novel. But either way, good to catch in with him again. So the interesting thing about what you were alluding to about Ristul is that once someone is corrupted, does the victim lose their individual identity or not? Because in part of the essay, you begin to wonder, well, yes, it does, of course. But then he comes in later and says, nah, we've figured it out. Not really, because victims are aware of the bending of their thoughts, the perversion of their memories, and so forth. And that's the beauty, the dark, evil beauty of Ristul. That's what it feeds on. So the more it shows you exactly how you are not you anymore and how twisted you become, that's where Ristul feeds.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's that Ouroboros, eating your own tail. It just never stops.
Ultimately, it's just a fascinating concept and really cool in a sort of like atypical sense, because unlike just about every other entry in this book, there's no monster to slay, ultimately.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead and nail your shadow to a wall. Try that. This is how philosophically esoteric it is to combat Ristul. Ristul can take many forms, all of them of which are corrupt, by the way, and that
by definition,
kind of like a big duh, but we knew that by definition. Yes. So when Ristul does show up physically, more often than not, it's a Nightwist, which we talked about previously. But otherwise, again, it doesn't have to be a Nightwist. It's just more often than others, so it's a plurality.
So the Nightwist is one expression of Ristul's influence. Another are what are called the Ristular, which are basically the sort of name givers that have been subsumed and corrupted by Ristul.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Who are acting sort of as extensions of the corrupting desire and influence of this being.
Yeah.
And simply being in proximity to them long enough could be enough for that corruption to take root in you and eventually grow and subsume you into that collective. There's a kind of like combined body snatchers / Borg thing going on with
kind
this.
Of nuclear radiation.
Yeah.
You just stay there long enough and you're done.
It's got, like, the stat block in the original Horrors book is not applicable for most of the stats that are available.
I was going to say, I was going to say, most of them are just NA.
Yeah.
So I was all like, that's the fun part. Let's talk stats or not.
Let's talk stats. It's got spellcasting because that's what it uses for its powers.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a spell defense, mystic defense as it would be in 4th edition. It's got a mystic armor because I guess like the idea is that if you are in a place where there's like an astral rift of some sort that it might be manifesting or coming through, you could perhaps blast it with magic, or there are, because of its status as kind of corruption incarnate, there are powers or abilities that might be able to affect the corruption and maybe damage it in some way. But it doesn't have a death rating. It doesn't have a wound threshold. Like, you can't really harm it in any capacity.
Yeah.
And it's got just a couple of powers. It's got corrupt karma. Mm-hmm. It's got horror mark, obviously. It's got horror thread, which is a sort of variant horror mark type ability, and karma tap. The horror itself can just kind of do things to you, but there's not really much of anything that you can do back to it.
No.
And so all I think that you could ultimately do is drive back its manifestations, defeat the Nightwists, slay the Ristular, things like that. But ultimately, it's just an implacable, undefeatable foe that you survive. You don't defeat it. You maybe drive it away or disrupt the plans of its agents, for lack of a better term, those corrupted extensions of its will that, might be operating to try and expand its influence.
Mm-hmm. Or you just escape it. Like getting out of the path of a tsunami. You just escaped it.
Right.
You can't really fight that one.
The advantage to Ristul ultimately is that if you are not in an area where it has manifested, you're perfectly safe from it. It can't really do anything in areas that it has not appeared. Unfortunately, Nightwists and Ristular count as manifestations of it for the purposes of it being able to do stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, when it comes to stories and games using this, again, you're looking at a much more traditional Lovecraftian kind of thing where you don't slay it, you merely disrupt its plans for now. Mm-hmm. To the extent that it has plans.
Yeah, yeah.
How conscious or guided is this thing? Are the actions of the Ristular and cultists something they're an extension of its will, or is it simply that the corruption that they have become subsumed in drives them to wish to extend that corruption wherever they can?
Yeah.
When you're looking at a game involving Ristul, you're looking at a game that probably is going to be dealing with a lot more, in a sense, like traditional horror cult kind of stuff, where you've got a bunch of name givers who are affected or worshipping this entity to some extent and maybe having dark plots that are part of what's going on, and your group will just need to find the source of the problem and slay the cult and disrupt whatever rituals or problems they might have.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that you're dealing with for the most part. Maybe dealing with some Nightwists or other kind of entities that are extensions of this being.
Yeah. And then introducing the creeps as the game master. Yeah, your characters are kind of getting the creeps around this. And that's just that overall feeling of something here's not right. But the longer you stay here, the more of the creeps you're going to get.
Yeah.
So we can't talk more about Ristul until we talk about the tale of Aras Nehem and Kaer Otosk.
So this is one idea about why the Mad Passions might have gone mad. The idea being that Kaer Otosk was built in the cliffsides on the Aras coast, kind of near the Thunder Mountains, and that there were a trio of temples that were built in a perfect triangle that, through, ritual magic and whatnot, created a theoretically safe space to exist in like a pyramid shape kind of up above them. and that the three temples were dedicated to Vestrial, Rashomon, and Arendis. Depending on which version of the story you believe, the Passions went mad and betrayed those there and opened a rift to let Ristul through, and it is only through great effort that those who survived, the trolls who survived Kaer Otosk, were able to escape, eventually making their way up the coast to where the Coil River emptied into the Aras Sea and meeting the Beshestis, Diskrang, and whatnot, eventually founding Europa. But Cymric posits that there may be a case where it was not that the Passions betrayed everyone, but that the Passions sacrificed themselves in order to keep Ristul from coming through the astral rift that had opened there. And that because the horror sort of devours the minds and personalities of those that it absorbs, it's not powerful enough to completely absorb the Passions. They are too vast, they are too powerful, there is too much to them in order for them to be destroyed in that way, and that they are basically sort of keeping it occupied through this sacrifice that they had made, but that they are being corrupted by Ristul as a result of that sacrifice, and that is why they are sort of mad and twisted in the way that they are. That is a very interesting idea. Mm-hmm. If you are going to be running a game that is involving, in some capacity, the redemption of the Mad Passions, this may be something that you want to factor into your game in some sense. Kaer Otosk would likely be a very, very dangerous place to explore or delve into. Certainly a very sort of legendary Kaer delve would be involved there, and the entities and creatures that you are likely to encounter in such a place are twisted and dangerous and whatever.
Messed up.
It's interesting because there are other stories of when the Passions, or when the first indications that the Passions had gone mad appeared. There was what was it called? Enthralled, the Whisper Rebellion or something like that. It was like the first indication that Rashomon had gone mad, and that kind of happened early in the Scourge, which makes things very interesting in terms of how that would work out with regards to Kaer Otosk, because if the Passions went mad early in the Scourge, it's a weird kind of nebulous timeline. We're not exactly sure what's going on, and I, in some respects, from a game development standpoint, personally prefer to kind of keep that open and a mystery to be solved and maybe defined within your own game, rather than coming up with an answer for that. In kind of a similar way that we don't really explain what the Passions really are, or what the nature of the Passions are in the Questor's book, which I know upset some people. But that's the sort of thing that you would want to explore. But yeah, man, Ristul is phenomenal. Just a great, interesting idea, and a lot of places that you can derive ideas or inspiration from various kind of horror media. You want to kind of take similar idea, or maybe a twist on a game that might involve Ristul, to maybe have like a cursed item associated with Ristul. Look at something like The Ring. In that story, you've got the videotape that if you watch it and you are able to pass it along, then you're okay. But that like kind of spreading corruption that kind of goes about with something like that. There's kind of a zombie movie kind of idea. I would actually think even more like a sort of more vampire spread curse or notion.
Yeah.
Because rather than becoming sort of mindless, destructive things, you've got these beings that are still in some sense intelligent or rational, for whatever definition that is for these corrupted individuals, but wanting to spread that infection and corruption, as far as they are, like human virus or contagion. A lot of potential for creepy, like, cult behavior. Look at delving into stuff like the original Wicker Man, or there was another sort of like recent horror movie, like looking at ones that have weird traditional pagan cults kind of thing, where the behaviors and practices are dressed up in this kind of traditional folksy way, but have this really dark secret undertone to them, as stuff that you could have if you've got like a village or community that is dedicated to Ristul in some way. There's just a lot of really neat things that you can have. And the fact that you're dealing with an entity that ultimately can't be defeated or slain the way that some of these other ones that we're going to talk about are, you're talking about a very different style of game, a lot more traditional horror, as in the genre, in a sense, as opposed to the potentially heroic fantasy with, or dark fantasy with, kind of some tropes of horror in terms of body manipulation or psychological whatever.
Gotchas. This is like almost a haunted house where once you get in, you're like, something not right happened here, and your characters should get the creeps, as I said, and just there's this overall unsettling feeling that eventually just slowly overtakes your characters and gets kind of go from there. So that's Ristul, and I think it's a lovely esoteric / philosophical thought experiment is exactly how you could use Ristul, but it's almost limitless.
I like the idea that is presented as well in the essay that, what's his name? Mumis? Is that the Nethermancer? Mumis?
So,
who believed that people could be rescued or retrieved from that, and that in a sense his study of the thing, trying to find a way to do that, is one of the things that kind of opened him up as well to the corruption that is Ristul, in a sense. That, again, is very kind of classic Lovecraftian idea of a researcher delving into things that are better left unstudied or unknown, and becoming tainted and corrupted and driven mad in a way by the knowledge that they learn.
So speaking of Taint.
Yes. So moving on to a different...
A little 180 on this one.
Not completely.
Not really. Not completely. Well, since Ristul is so esoteric and you can't quite nail it down, we're talking about the cover girl here of the horrors. I thought Taint was on the cover.
I'm not sure. That picture appears again in the color section.
Yeah, it's Taint.
Is it Taint? Okay.
It is Taint. So yeah, we're talking the cover girl, Taint. This is I also love the fact that this essay comes from Vastanyas.
Yes.
Vastanyas. How do you say it?
Vastanyas.
That Taint marks its prey by tainting the flow of magic to adepts. So speaking of esoteric again, not quite the level of Ristul, but this is
a much more like specific and deliberate.
Yeah.
It is much more focused rather than just being broadly corruption qua corruption. Mm-hmm. This is a very specific, like focused, targeted,
almost
twisting and warping and corruption. It is kind of slow. It is insidious.
Almost Machiavellian.
Well, in a sense, without the sort of political manipulation that's involved.
Fair.
It is just very gradual, very subtle. And by the time you realize that it's got its hooks in you, it's too late.
Yes.
Taint is a purely astral horror. Mm-hmm. It does not appear in the physical realm at all. It really likes and understands corrupted astral space. In fact, it gains additional concealment above and beyond the normal difficulty of perceiving things in more polluted astral space. So it can be very, very difficult to spot, which means that it can very easily, if you are in such an area, hang out near you and have plenty of time to mess with you. Normal people don't really have anything to fear directly from Taint because they don't use magic in the way that adepts and particularly magicians do.
Oh, yes.
Taint loves magicians because magicians manipulate magic
all the time,
a lot more freely than other adepts do. And even using matrices is not enough to protect you from the effects of Taint, which is part of the reason why he is in some ways such a frightening and dangerous horror to adepts and magicians in particular. What happens is that where a lot of horrors are able to mark you, and then once you're marked, they've got full access to your stuff.
Yeah.
Or, whatever it is that they are able to do to you. Taint, because it is concealing its gradual corruption or the gradual influence on you that eventually becomes a mark, actually has to make multiple horror mark tests, and as written in the first edition Horrors book, can only make those tests under certain circumstances.
Yes.
Which is part of the reason why he likes magicians so much, because those opportunities come up a lot more frequently than they do with non-spellcasting adepts. But once it has made enough successful tests, then you are fully marked, and then it's got you, and it can do funky, scary, nasty stuff with your magical abilities when it wants to. There is the chance, if it somehow fails one of those initial mark tests on you, that you might be able to notice that something weird is going on with your magic and be able to figure out what's going on. But whether that is ultimately going to protect you or not is an open question. That maybe simply by not going into corrupted or tainted space, you might be able to protect yourself a little bit better because it doesn't like those open or safe spaces as much, but it can still go in them. It's just a lot more easy to notice. And as an astral horror, obviously you have pretty limited options in terms of what you can do to it until you get into higher circles and have abilities that allow you to target astral entities or cross into astral space or something like that. So,
to Josh's point, Taint does mark you slowly, gradually over time, almost unnoticeably, and it can conceal the use of this power even as it marks you. And so it's so gradual and so slow, and it is so patient that there's the story of Kaer Orenthal, where it literally took 20 years for it to finally mark its first victim and then cause all the destruction on the inside. So it was so patient and so dedicated that nobody picked up on it for, 2 decades. So that's how insidious Taint can actually be. When you, if you encounter Taint on the astral plane, it just appears as a huge bodiless head, which is again why it's on the cover of the Horrors book, because it's just A, fantastic art, and B, creepy as all get out. But of course, it appears amid swirls of polluted astral energy. But my favorite part of this essay is how not to approach Taint. No physical act can touch it. The only way to destroy this horrible entity is to cast powerful magic at it or confront it on the astral plane. Methods: 1, to combat the horror in its natural element. Both are extremely dangerous. In the former case, Taint can turn the spells you cast back against you. And in the latter case, you end up battling Taint on battleground it has spent its entire existence learning to understand, and of which you almost know nothing by comparison.
Yeah. In reference to that first bit, the most frightening and dangerous aspect of Taint is its corrupt magic ability. This is sort of an almost unique ability that it has. I'm not aware of anything similar among other horrors. But once it has marked you, it has the potential of changing your magic. When you try and do something with your magic, it can have a different result show up. And there are several examples that are given in the book. One of them is you simply take damage as if you had cast a spell, a raw magic spell in an area. You just take damage from doing it. Nothing else happens, you just take the damage. Another possibility is that the result of your magic use is different than what you plan. Like if you were casting a healing spell, it might harm the target. Or if you're casting a damaging spell, rather than hitting the target that you wanted, it might hit an ally. Its understanding of magical energy is so extensive and finessed that it can do whatever it wants to any attempts that you make to do magic. Which means that if it has marked you and you're going up against it by casting spells, it could very well just kill you with your own magical abilities.
It can tweak a little or it can tweak a lot.
or use those magical abilities to, wipe out your allies in terms of the fight. Despite the fact that its numbers as written aren't particularly high, the fact that it has the ability to fundamentally alter the way that your magic expresses itself. You don't need huge numbers for that. That basically it turns its own power against you. Never mind the difficulty if you are able to cross into astral space to fight it there. Typically, that sort of thing is going to result in you taking damage while you are in astral space, because it's likely going to be in a tainted or corrupted area. And then, of course, once you are marked and are aware that your magic is being warped and shaped by this horror, what are you going to do? You can't trust your own abilities anymore. The only way to keep other people safe is simply to not use them or to isolate yourself. But even isolating yourself, anytime that you use your abilities, it could even turn them on you. And that helplessness and fear and despair that comes about as a result of that is just...
Oh, yeah, because you're just filled with self-doubt and you're bereft of any confidence. And so, yeah, he's just going to feed on that.
Yeah. And in a way, the more powerful the adept that it targets, the worse that becomes because their abilities are that much more powerful. And the amount of influence that they could have on the world...
The greater fall from grace?
Is greater comparatively. And so... this is one of those that really is a horror that I think would be better used as a long-term opponent for the player characters themselves, maybe discovering that they are becoming affected by it or whatever, and needing to find a solution or to come up with some way to defeat it, and the dangers that kind of go along with that. Now, obviously, this runs into the problems that we've discussed in the past when it comes to running horrors against your player character group. It is very easy as a game master to use a horror like Taint to just completely screw over your player character group. Once it's got its hooks in you, it has the potential to really just screw up your character's ability to do anything. And that can be very disheartening for the players and deprotagonizing in a sense. And so it is something that you would want to bring into play only if everybody is sort of on board. You could potentially introduce it or have it be something that is affecting other folks. Like if you don't want to maybe be quite as direct, perhaps have it affect one of their mentors, one of their higher circle trainers or something like that.
I was just going to say the same thing. I was just going to say the same thing.
To kind of make it at least a little bit more personal. There comes that line of like what you're dealing with even when you're talking about horror genre gaming in general, and that is, to what extent do you want the players to feel some of what their characters might be feeling when it comes to the emotions and situations that they run into? And again, everybody should be on the same page, and you absolutely need to have player buy-in on this, and to not run this as a mystery that needs to be solved. You should have a sense by the time that you would be bringing an entity like this into play. You should have a sense of whether your player group would be willing to buy into this kind of problem. And maybe not give them everything up front, but again, go in preparing them for, I want to run a sort of horror scenario, or arc where your character's abilities are going to be affected by what's going on. And I want everybody to be aware of that going in and know that I am not going to
screw you over. The horror may be trying to screw the characters over. The horror is going to be doing what it does, but I'm going to play fair. Yeah, I'm not going to try and be a jerk about it, but this is a in-game reality that we need to address.
Right. A definite amount of trust and communication and everything that needs to go along with this. These first couple of horrors, both of them are very psychological and creepy and tainting and corrupting in their own way, pardon the
very
pun.
twisty.
It's just that Ristul is one that you can involve it without necessarily completely screwing the players over in that regard. You can sort of have them going up against Ristular and Nightwists and things like that, where there's danger and there's the risk of getting corrupted without necessarily having them get subsumed into the entity. But with Taint, it is a little bit more directly personal. Ristul going after you is not personal. It doesn't seem to have the guiding intelligence to necessarily target somebody. It just wants to sort of corruptly consume everything. Taint is a lot more personal and will target individuals and will corrupt and warp and destroy their ability or their confidence in their abilities.
It's all about tearing you down, giving you self-doubt, lack of confidence, and then you are left knowing that you can't do anything about it. And so you are inside your own helplessness in your own mind. And that's where Taint loves to be.
And that is a great place for a story, a novel or a short story or something like that, having the perspective of a character who is in that kind of situation. But that is very different from playing a character in a game where those sorts of things might happen to you. If you are willing to put yourself into that situation, and not everybody is, that's perfectly fair. That is, to sidestep here a little bit, that is, I think, perhaps the biggest weakness of Blades when it comes to that as an adventure collection, because a big chunk of the story around that involves a curse that is on these items that the characters don't learn about until they're already wrapped up in it. While it's not as insidious and affecting your abilities the way that Taint is, there is still, I imagine, a way that can be approached where people can feel really, really bad. Like there was a bait and switch pulled. Oh, we got this really cool item. Oh, we suddenly discover it's cursed, and now everybody that we're around suffers as a result of what we've done with this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, ultimately, it does end in confronting and lifting the curse from the item, but I can definitely understand how people might come at that if not in the correct mindset or if not approached properly in terms of the meta-narrative, the session zero discussions that happen around a campaign, how that might be a problem. And Taint is in a very similar kind of space to that, in that if you are going to be targeting your player characters with it, you need their buy-in. You need their understanding and their trust in order to handle it appropriately.
What other powers does Taint have?
Well, I mean, aside from the corrupt magic, which is the big one, it's got corrupt karma. So on top of like corrupting the magical ability, it can mess with your ability to spend karma on top of that.
Which is so important in 4th edition.
And it's also got spellcasting equivalent to a Circle 10 wizard.
Oh, yeah.
Which is no small shakes. Looking at 1st edition, the numbers aren't super high.
No, but it's mostly an astral entity, so very few are going to be able to encounter it on its home turf.
And be able to easily deal with it. A lot of the things that would be able to affect it require higher powered stuff, and there's a lot of nastiness that can go along with that.
Taint is a formidable opponent, as all horrors should be. Is formidable. So it's not one of those, hey, I defeated a horror. You just chalk them up like you do, No, you can't do that. These are intentionally the big bad guys at the end of the adventure that you need to decipher that they're there, get to them, and somehow have a strategy. Because if you just go in blind, you're not going to make it. Have a strategy to comprehend, understand, and defeat them. And Ristul is just, go ahead and cut.
Yeah. Again, Ristul is incomprehensible, implacable.
Yes.
Eternal corruption. Taint, I do like the suggestion that they give for Taint. Taint is particularly good against higher powered groups that have been adventuring a while and think they've seen it all.
This is not so straightforward.
Yeah, the horrors that they might have faced before would tend to perhaps be more physical, and while they might be frightening and dangerous and scary, this is a very different kind of scary. It's a very different approach. And that's one of the things that I think is really strong about the Horrors book overall. It does provide a bunch of different styles and genres and flavors of fear and horror, that they're not all just, oh, these are all just bigger, nastier stat blocks, that there are implacable entities and there are subtle entities and things that, on the one sense, might not seem particularly powerful in one sense, but can also be very, very difficult because of the way that they approach things, because of the environment that they create, the situations that you are going to run into them in. It's really, really cool. And I actually am kind of glad in a way that we're starting off our series with these two, because they are in some ways really different from the other horrors and horror constructs and stuff that we've dealt with, almost all of which have been physical, scary, and maybe big numbers and dangerous powers and whatnot. But these two are both just
another level.
Yeah, showing how varied horrors can be in terms of adversary or obstacle or whatever to be dealt with.
Yeah, so this is the two that I would look at and say, okay, so your adventure group has seen a lot, seen it all, whatever the case may be. You've run horror games before. You've played Call of Cthulhu, maybe. You think you know what horrors are. I introduce you to Ristul, and I introduce you to Taint. And then there's worse after this, too.
Yeah, but they're worse in different ways.
Totally. But this is the two I go, so you think you know horror gaming. So you think you know creepy things from maybe an extra-dimensional plane.
Yeah, not even horror gaming, but you think you know Earth Dawn.
Yeah.
There is a tendency to think of horrors as these physical, powerful demons. They're the nasty, strong, tough, magically potent entities. It's tough to drive a sword through them, but you are able to do so eventually.
Yeah.
Neither of these fit into that category.
No, because Ristul is more like, how do you fight your own mind?
How do you fight the tide?
Yeah, how do you fight the tide? And then Taint is one of those, oh, how do I do anything anymore? Because I've built up all my talents and things, and I've relied on this magic that has permeated me like the Force. And all of a sudden, oh, I've been using the dark side of the Force the entire time. Well, crap. It's not even that. Yeah.
It's not even like that straightforward.
No, not even.
The dark side of the Force is something that you kind of make a conscious choice to use. This is a case of simply by using the Force, now suddenly everything's dark side, whether I want it to be or not.
Yes.
That's a very not Star Wars kind of concept.
But I had to go along with something.
Yeah.
But yeah, these are two, like I said, if you think you know Earth Dawn and you think you know horror gaming and you think you know since, no, you're in a whole different realm here, sweetheart. And that's what we're going to leave you with right now. So welcome to Ristul. Welcome to Taint. We got a bunch more to get through. We won't always do 2 per episode, but these two kind of fit well together.
It depends.
Depends on who we're going to talk about or what we're going to talk about.
And how much discussion.
But until next time, folks, yeah, go have some nightmares for your legend because you're going to fight some.
Good night, everybody.